And suppose that you could buy a magic threat feed, right, that would tell you this country is coming after you with this tradecraft at this time. The question you have to ask then is, what will I do with that? Because defending yourself almost always requires some visibility and change into your environment.
This is a Security Weekly production. Security Weekly is a resource of Cyber Risk Alliance.
The Cybersecurity Collaborative, in conjunction with Cyber Reason, is proud to present CISO Stories. Each week, CISO Stories takes a deep dive on security leadership. The Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/CSC. I am your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome Tony Sager, SVP and Chief Evangelist, Center for Internet Security.
Wow. Believe it or not, I stumbled into it completely by accident. So I was an undergraduate math major in a small liberal arts college, and my dad was a career Army guy and then civil servant afterwards. And my actual career goal was to be a operations research mathematician. I loved the military kinds of things, and I had a summer job during college of working with mathematicians who were modeling guns and rockets, sort of pretending and looking at the aerodynamics and the hit probabilities and that sort of thing. So that was always kind of my idea. It was a loose idea, but it was an idea. And then my senior year of college, a fellow happened to walk into a recent graduate had walked into the math faculty area. And this is the mid 70s now. So he turned out to be, he was like the perfect NSA recruit of that era. He had an advanced degree in mathematics, and he was a native Russian speaker. So you could have gotten a job anywhere in the State Department or
Sure.
NSA or whatever. So we got to talking, and he said, so what are you going to do after graduation? In a very small math department, maybe 10 to 12 seniors in any given year. Most went to graduate school. I said, well, I'm a little burned out. I don't want to go to grad school. And I was thinking about going to the Department of the Army. And he said, do you ever think about NSA? I said, NSA, is that where they make the rockets and stuff? He goes, no, NSA. And he gave me a little brochure that I still have to this day, which was, mathematicians, if you're interested in a career at NSA, call this phone number, and here's the kind of things that you do. So I wound up completely cold calling this number, taking an incredibly hard math test, and by the skin of my teeth getting in the door at NSA, working in what was then known as communication security. And the focus on confidentiality, right? And sort of government to government was the fight of the day. My life changed forever a few years later, because in 1981 I changed my career field to computer science, and it was primarily not because I had this grand vision of what was going to happen, but because the government would buy me an Apple II Plus to have on my desk, and I thought that was the coolest thing ever. And
I had one of
did
those.
You? Yes. So, my first experience with computing was literally the room full of a computer, right? And punch cards and be nice to the guy that works the counter so you can get more than one run of your program in a day.
And not drop the deck.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Oh, the first time I ever saw a grown man in uniform cry, you know what happened, right? We were hot-footing it with big Fortran card decks crossing the parking lot. He stubbed his toe. It crosses the parking lot. He just sits down on the curb because it was entire summer's work. And do you remember there was the rightmost field of a Hollerith card, right? You could put a sequence number in there. So you could always put the cards back in a sorter. Mm-hmm. But of course, that took an extra fraction of a second to punch those holes. So he didn't bother with that because he wouldn't need that. He had just ruined, literally a summer's worth of work. But anyway, and it wasn't because the government thought it would be fun to give me a computer, which is what I thought. It was because we were seeing the first use of personal computing for security and high sensitivity government applications. And so they were looking for a group of people to kind of take a look at these kinds of things and see what the implications would be. So lucky me, that allowed me to ride the wave that became, from communication security to computer security to information security, and kind of to the world that we had today. So I'd love to tell you I had a grand plan and a big vision, but I was really just going kind of where technology went, and it was just so fun I couldn't stop.
Sure. And so your work through most of your career was where?
Well, at 35 years at the National Security Agency, all of it working in defense, and all of it, you might call it today black hat work or penetration testing work. So in the early days of looking at U.S. systems, right, that we were developing for ourselves. So remember, this is when the Army would take 10 to 15 years to build a new radio. So, back in those days we had, it didn't seem like it at the time, but we had the luxury of lots of money, lots of time, and control of the environment. Right? You could pick your contractors, you could pick your suppliers, you could decide that only people with a clearance got to work on the designs, that kind of stuff. And if we didn't get it right the first time, we would just, take another year, right, to redesign it again. But that seems so quaint now. But I spent my life, I'll call it security testing for defense. So it went from primarily the mathematics of algorithms and randomization to software. I was one of the first, what's called a software vulnerability analyst at NSA. Okay. So looking at other people's software, trying to find 0 days, you would call it today.
Sure.
And then, and that was part of government development programs. Then networking sort of dominated as the big challenge, right? This connectivity around the world of systems. And then the sort of more all-purpose cyber thing. So I went from kind of working analyst to frontline supervisor to eventually executive manager. And my kind of capstone job was I ran the security testing for defense. So, 700-800 people on any given day, military and civilian, who were dedicated to this business of, everything from red team testing, blue team testing, 0-day finding and software analysis of protocols and all that. So that's what really shaped my view of the business. And I would say at one point, I got to see as much failure as probably anybody in the business. At really large scale, worldwide, and then as part of that work. But I can also say, again, with all humility, I was one of the few lifelong defenders who got to do that work inside an intelligence agency. So you get to see how nations attack each other, how they attack us, and how we attack them. Sure. Right. So I thought of that as kind of like the graduate education in defense, right? Really seeing nation states attack.
So you took that, and tell us a little bit about you've taken that and that helped build some of the controls.
Sure.
That we have today.
By getting to see a lot how things fail, right? And the real observation, and this is not rocket science anymore, when you see the same problems over and over again, including at the same location 3 months later, 6 months later, right? So you would dutifully send, high-priced, very clever people to do penetration testing. You dutifully give the PowerPoint, brief the general, everyone's happy, and then you come back and it's again, right? And you see it not only again and again in this location, but in every location like it. And you realize that just pointing out problems sort of one by one never gets them fixed, right? Resolving problems is a mix of behavior and economics and policy, and it's not a technical question, right? Do I know the right technical answer? It's all these other dynamics of decision making and so forth, and training of people, and does DoD policy actually take you in the wrong direction instead of the right direction? So once I got to see kind of this scalability of lessons, and then look at how this sort of national level attack problem, I said, there's something really going wrong here, right? And many of those jobs came up in their own stovepipe. And I stole this term from somebody else. Stovepipes are, that's impolite, right? Not politically correct, so we call them cylinders of excellence. So the red team would find their results, but they weren't, it was so sensitive, right? This flaw in the government system. We couldn't possibly tell anybody else.
Couldn't share that.
Right, including with the people who were tasked to go fix it. That was literally true for the early days of this. And I knew this because the blue team, which was tasked with fixing problems, was often going to deal with problems the red team found, but not authorized to hear the result. So once I got in a management position, I said, I'm going to combine these things, put the same Navy captain in charge, and the measure of success is not what do we find, it's what gets fixed. Right? So as I started to see this, how do I take this repeated knowledge of failure over and over again? Another observation was that there's a saying I used, the optimal place to solve a security problem is almost never where you found it. So we often find problems in the operational environment, right? We test through penetration testing. But it turns out, why is that flaw there? It often is because of the way we buy things, right? The acquisition part of the cycle, or the way we train people, or the DoD policy, or certain problems can only be fixed by the vendor, at the root. And so if you don't take the information you find in these flaws and sort of think about them and say, where's the optimal place to solve them? And so I need to push it to the right place, not just to the general that owns that military base. Once you have that opportunity, then you can start thinking about optimizing solutions. So we sort of take these lessons and bundle them up. And the real first embodiment was the NSA security guides. That is, we would, we never had like an office dedicated to writing things like a DISA STIG, if you know what that is. Right? NSA was one of the pioneers of that kind of work.
What a
STIG is a security technical implementation guide.
Right.
Basically, it's for a given piece of IT, Windows desktop, a mail server, a web server, what's the optimal way to configure it? All the options and settings and knobs and switches. What's the optimal way to set it up for best security and still have a viable running operational system, right? And so that's, in the late 90s, that was still kind of a novelty. There were commercial versions, SANS did some things, NIST had the early program, the Center for Internet Security, its earliest incarnation had that. NSA called them security guides. DISA, the Defense Information Systems Agency, called them STIGs. Right, so it was the official standard for the DoD. Turns out a couple of those were actually NSA documents with their cover on, right, by design. But the idea was, I could, rather than let everybody figure it out themselves, I could kind of bundle up the lessons learned into a positive, constructive thing, right? The security guide. Right. Make it DoD policy or give it away. Yeah. So I was able to, in June of 2001 to get permission to release that to the public. And the goal there was, we were seeing the emergence of things like, number one, universal connectivity, right? Everyone's connected. The DoD supply chain is becoming very commercialized. But you were also seeing, there was sort of no perimeter, right? The perimeter was starting to disappear. So the way I would describe it is, you can't make the DoD better without everybody else getting better, right? All their suppliers and shippers and people that sell us meals and uniforms. So you have to figure a way to raise the security of the entire environment, right? No one gets to isolate themselves from the environment, including the DoD, right? The big, bad, well-funded DoD.
The article this podcast is based upon can be viewed in the best-selling cybersecurity leadership book, CISO Compass, Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers, available at Amazon.com and other booksellers.
So the idea,
the way we should be thinking today.
Oh, absolutely, right.
It was our vendors and our supply chain.
Exactly. I mean, there is no one that can operate right without being deeply interconnected with a constantly changing set of partners, supply chain friends, et cetera, right? So that's just the nature of the business. So to me, it just said, then you have to find ways to raise the level of all boats or whatever your model might happen to be. So the idea there, signaling from NSA that we really wanted to be a part of the community, right? And here's our contribution to the community. So that became kind of the way we bundled up the lessons learned. So that started me speaking in the public. We think this is what we've done. Your taxpayer dollars paid for it. If this can help you, we're happy to give it to you. And then what happened was, and this was to my surprise, to be honest, Todd, right? The most frequent question I would get when I'd go out, 2000, 2002 to speak about this was, that's great stuff. Thanks very much. Where do I begin? And I would say, well, the usual stuff, right? Well, NIST, there's all great documentation and got all this good documents here, and the NSA stuff we've released, that's great. And they would go, well, yeah, but I mean, that's thousands of pages. Right. I don't even have people who can read this, right? Where do I begin? My boss has a limited attention span. I only have a budget for one or two things right now. I only have 3 people working for me. Where do I begin? I thought, so here was the, again, humbling revelation. Oh, I've never actually had responsibility to fix a problem. My job was to point people's problems out, right? These are the real problems of people who have to solve this. You do have to start somewhere, right? You have to convince a boss. You have to buy a thing. So that sent me like, oh, wow. Shame on me. So I went back to the fort and I grabbed 5 extraordinary friends, and so, none of my friends are ordinary. they're all unique in their own way. But think of it as the technical leader of the red team.
Right?
In a good way. It's part of what makes this business great, right? So the technical leader of the red team, blue team, but also a professional attacker for the U.S. government, right? A leading technologist for the NSA enterprise, right? One of the most complicated enterprises on earth, and someone who studied foreign threats for a living, right? So early days of threat intelligence. And the challenge, we're in a little room around the table, and I said, so let me start this meeting off. We're not going to be here all day. We're going to spend a couple hours. Nobody leaves the room till we all agree on a small number of things that all of our friends should do to get started. And the only advice or the only guidance I'm putting on the table right now is you're not allowed to solve world hunger at this table. Because you put security people in the room, they want to up each other, how clever they are. Oh, you have 10 recommendations, I got 5 more. Oh, you can point out 50 vulnerabilities, I got 25 more, right? It's just nature, the nature of the people. We're clever, right? We can daydream all day about weird attack scenarios. I said, but people are overwhelmed. So small number to me means 5 to 7. Let's see if we can, again, don't solve the problem, let's get started. And people being what they are, right? This people draw is really, really interesting, really bright, and highly opinionated people. So I got them to agree to 10. So the simplest imaginable 2-page letter gets composed, goes to the Pentagon and a bunch of friends, and basically says, based on our experience, if you don't know where to begin, start here. Right? Never dreamed that it would go, it would become a big deal. A few months later, the team leader pokes his door in my head and said, the SANS Institute got a hold of this letter. They want to know if they can build a community project around it. And they, of course, the SANS Institute, right?
Yeah.
They're not capable of doing anything at small scale. They only operate big scale. So a 2-page letter turns into thousands of people on a mailing list and events and posters and classes and all kinds of things, and kind of roughly created the form that we now call the CIS, Critical Security Controls. But the philosophy was the same, right? You can't do everything. Can we identify foundational elements and not daydream about all the bad things that might happen, but look at what really is happening, right? Real knowledge. And people say share is the solution to world hunger and peace in our time in this business. I think that's overrated. I always say the most important variable in this business is not share, it's translate, right? How do I take millions of data points of badness and translate them into a small number of positive, constructive steps? Because most people will never make sense of millions of data points.
Right? It's just overwhelming.
It's overwhelming,
too
right?
much.
It's that you cannot ask all these large and small businesses in our economy to deal with that scale of problem. Oh, and by the way, they don't have to deal with that problem alone, right? If you accept the premise that there's this soup of bad stuff happening all the time, we all have to deal with it whether we know it or not, whether we pay for a risk assessment or we don't, we still have to deal with this soup of bad stuff, right? Therefore, there's no reason we couldn't share our labor, share our knowledge in this translation problem. So that's a kind of a professional life philosophy for me. And so that's essentially what we do at CIS. We crowdsource, and we don't use that term, but this idea of common danger, common hazard, limited data to work with, but it affects us all. Put the best brains, the best volunteers we can to sort of mentally do that translation into positive steps that can be shared very broadly, built into tools, made a policy, etc., is really the bedrock of what we do at CIS. And so for me, it all really started from this "where do I begin" question, right? It's that's a real question, right? There's never in our history have we had so many frameworks, guidance documents, training certifications, right? We have more to work with as defenders than we've ever had in the history of this business.
The difficulty is getting it down to where do we start from.
It's not the lack of solutions.
What were some of the, I know that I'm familiar with the controls, but just for our listeners, what are a couple of those controls that are really important?
The intuitive answer I gave without really giving it much thought, frankly, when people started asking me that, what do I do, first question, was what just came out of my mouth and kept coming out of my mouth was around visibility. Knowing how professional attackers work, right? I mean, determined, funded nation state, who build the infrastructure, who do reconnaissance, right? Who are willing to, they're not necessarily looking for the one-time attack, they're looking for the infrastructure type attack. Visibility of what you own, whether it's your hardware, your software, the state of it, is it configured, has anything changed about it? Sort of the infrastructure of visibility to me was a bedrock security principle. And it's, for some of the industry, it's not that exciting, right? And yet it's so central to dealing with this problem. So as the adversary gets in once, if they have unlimited ability to move, escalate, and so forth, it's because you don't have visibility, right? You don't know when things have changed, you don't know what right looks like, you don't know when machines have been added, you don't know when software is being updated without your knowledge, you don't know when a user has inadvertently changed something. So it kind of starts from there. It's complementary to that.
Knowing what your assets are.
And so it's we translate that in IT talk to things like hardware inventory, right? Software inventory, configuration management. So knowing the attack surface, knowing that my software is configured in the state with, I'll call it known security properties, right? A minimized attack surface. And then knowing when that changes, when something inadvertently changes or an update inadvertently blows away, some of the security settings. So just the management of that is key. You have to couple that, I think, with things like the management of administrative privilege. Okay, so, in physical space, we would say, do I know, the physical layout of my building, and are all the doors locked, and have the keys? Do I know who has keys? That sort of stuff, right? And do I know who has the ability? Who has the codes for my alarm system? Who has the ability to bypass or change the settings that either monitor or manage security in my environment? Well, the equivalent of that in IT space are things like administrative privilege, right? Mm-hmm. And so, many enterprises, they sort of give up, right? Everyone has administrative privilege because the researchers whine because they can't install whatever software they want, or what, you've got all these, they're not technical issues as much as they are cultural issues. But if you look at the opening of the controls and the sort of, core set of things, most of them are really about good IT management, right? And in fact, I think it's fair to say that the roots of good security are good IT management. That is the infrastructure. And you don't want to build necessarily a separate infrastructure to manage security if you could avoid it, right? When in fact, I have a lot of power in a well-managed environment, actually gives me a lot of security power to start with, and I need it in any case. Mm-hmm. People want to say things like, "Oh, hey Tony, that control stuff, that's great, love it, mm-hmm. Good hygiene, rah rah rah, wonderful." But what about those wily APTs, right? What about those nation-state attackers? Yeah, I get it, right? They're good, no question, right? I don't want to downplay that, mm-hmm. But they don't do magic. Right? They have a budget, they have a boss, they have to do reconnaissance, right? They have to deploy software, they have to sort of maintain an infrastructure inside your network too. And so your goal is not perfection, your goal is raising their cost, raising their visibility, right? Making it more and more difficult for them to attack you. And suppose that you could buy a magic threat feed, right? That would tell you this country is coming after you with this tradecraft at this time. The question you have to ask them is, what will I do with that? Because defending yourself almost always requires some visibility and change into your environment. I better block this port. I better turn off this service. I better update this piece of software, right? I better look for signs, through logging that this kind of activity is occurring. In other words, if you had sort of magic insight into the bad guy, I lived in a place of magic, right? National Security Agency, and they would say the same thing. Magic threat feed, we're figuring out what the bad guys are doing. I said, great, what are we going to do with that? We're going to tell everybody that needs to know. Great, we're going to email all the sysadmins of the DoD, right? And in their infinite inbox, which is already overflowing, right? They're going to figure this out? No. So at the end of the day, you're going to take that information, that unique insight, which you hope you have. You're going to turn to your IT, ask it a question, get it to do something, right? Wouldn't it be great if you've already built that infrastructure because you have a well-managed environment, because you've already put in place good configuration management, right? Good configuration management has value in and of itself, right? It helps lower your costs, minimizes your troubleshooting of problems, right? Helps you sort of bound problems, put edges on them so you're not infinitely tracking down problems. So you get a lot of value. You can cost manageability, minimizing the software stomping on each other kinds of problems. So you don't want to create this separate, I'll call it an action architecture for special information. You really would like to use what you already have, if at all possible. Mm. So this is idea, good IT management and good security are really two sides of the coin, right? They're not, the APT is not a separate problem. It's an important problem. Mm. Most of us will never sort of think about that directly, right? We're too busy trying to deal with the mass market problem. But for those that can or face that kind of high risk and have the resources, again, wherever possible, you would like to say, I'm starting from where I know where I am. I have a well-managed environment. I have good visibility. If I get insight, then I can take action on it without having to sort of create new magic technology to implement it.
Great. Well, that's great advice, Tony, and it's really been a pleasure to talk with you today. I've really enjoyed your insights, and thank you for your contribution to this industry, which lives on, and many of our organizations are using the tools that you started.
Oh, thank you very much, John.
In that room years ago.
Yeah, and I appreciate it. It's one reason I keep working. Number one, this stuff is interesting, right? Socially important, but there's so many interesting and great people involved with it. Right? It's hard to walk away from. So I'll be around for a little bit longer, I think. So thanks so much.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Thanks a lot, Tony.
You're welcome. Take care.
CyberReason is the champion for today's defenders, providing an endpoint security platform to prevent, detect, and respond to malicious operations on computers, mobile devices, servers, and the cloud. CyberReason. End cyber attacks from endpoints to the enterprise to everywhere. Learn more at cyberreason.com/CISO stories.